Hello and welcome to Unfrozen. My name is Dan Safarik. This is episode 108.
The future is north. I'm your co-host Greg Lindsay, and we are joined this week by Jesse Keenan. Jesse is the Favrot II Associate Professor of Sustainable Real Estate and Urban Planning at Tulane University, where he is also Director of the Center on Climate Change and Urbanism. But I've known Jesse for more than a decade, and have talked to him endlessly about climate migration and talking about adaptation in climate. And we are so pleased to have him here today to talk about his forthcoming book, North, which is, I think, really probably the most accessible and sustained set of arguments by Jesse on, yes, where the world goes from here. Because it is interesting, as we tape this today, climate negotiators are, of course, meeting in Belém, Brazil for COP30. And it is interesting to me that a decade after the Paris Agreement and after the complete and total failure to mitigate carbon emissions, the conversation is finally shifting to adaptation. If we're going to go through this after all, how are we going to survive it? And now I think it's perfect timing to really bring in not just how we're going to harden landscapes and deal with sea level rise, but perhaps do the most unthinkable of all, which is to move and to adapt. So with that, Jesse, welcome to Unfrozen.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's a great privilege.
Well, for listeners who make it all the way to the end here, we're going to get to your final section on of climate fiction, the final chapter of the book, which is amazingly gonzo, the most gonzo chapter of anything I've ever read in a climate book. But first off, Jesse, if you could talk a bit about, obviously, I mean, your interest in this, and also not just the fact that you are an architect, but really also understand financial markets and are able to really combine the two to really outline the sort of the scale of what's happening in the United States and beyond. So I guess the way to tee us off here, what is your ultimate argument of North? I mean, is that where we're moving in?
Yeah, my ultimate argument is that people make decisions to adapt at all different scales, but it's not just people as a kind of household orientation. It's local governments, it's the federal government, state governments, it's businesses, it's small businesses, it's the global economy. We're all adapting in different ways. Sometimes adaptation to one group of people's, maladaptation to others, right? And one of the arguments I make in the book is that the market economy and many different components of the market economy and housing and insurance and real estate and mortgage finance and municipal bonds, et cetera, it's adapting. It's adapting to climate change. It's part of the climate intelligence arms race. There was a rush to analyze, develop, and get ahead of this, make money off of climate change, and that has some implications for people, and for some people it's quite maladaptive in terms of the distributional costs and burdens that places. In the long run, it's probably good. In the short run, there's a lot of pain. So the argument that I make is it's not that everybody's moving north as a kind of cardinal direction. That's an oversimplification. What the argument I'm more or less making is that, listen, we're going to be moving. A lot of that moving is going to be local. We're going to be moving from sending zones to receiving zones. That could be just across the county or within our township. But it could also be in transcontinental terms. There's some component of our population that is going to be on the move and moving pretty great distances to build new homes, communities, businesses, etc. And when we think about that mobility and that human mobility, and we think about the mobility of the underlying economy, there's different sort of aspects there that we can contextualize this, but climate's just one of many factors, right? There's housing affordability, there's, political identities, there's a million things going on. Climate is now just part of that landscape. So what I'm doing with this book is I'm saying, listen, climate's part of the decisions that shape, if you will, push and pull, that shape the decisions we're making about where to live, how to live, and where to start businesses, where to build our careers. Climate's on the table now. And that's going to fundamentally have influence over a lot of different things, sociocultural, economic, political. So let's come to a broader recognition that adaptation is exactly as you said. It's not just hardening seawalls and building dikes and things like that. That it's actually a much more profound shape shifting of our economy and our population.
All right, there's a lot to unpack there. Two things I want to start with then, I guess, is sort of like thinking about the trigger points or as this landscape evolves. One of which is, for, I don't know, since let's just say the post-war era, there has been a broad movement from the Northeast and Midwest and coastal metros into the Sun Belt. And there's a paper from the San Francisco Federal Reserve Bank, which you might have co-authored, but I think came out last year, arguing that like this flow may not last forever. And I'm curious, like when you see that flow shut off or start to reverse, and we see northward movement again. And yeah, and also the Atlantic has a piece in its new December issue that quotes you in the book that sort of broadly talks about basically sort of the climate sacrifice zones of the future and the left behind. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if you could talk about that, like broadly speaking, who will be these climmigrants in the future, and where are they likely headed then, at least from the United States context?
Yeah, so let's take on the Sun Belt first, because in the thesis that I brought up over the years that, people are going to be on the move, economies are on the move, there's a geography of risk and opportunity here. There are sending zones and receiving zones, and you could even call those dead zones, if you will. In that context, people always say, well, isn't everybody just moving to the Sun Belt where there's high exposure, particularly to physical climate risks? That's true. That has certainly been the case, but we have to understand how and why people moved to the Sun Belt. Initially, in the 1960s and 1970s, people did move because of a marginal willingness to pay, i.e. consumer preferences, at least is what the literature and the economics data tells us, for sunshine. They moved, and they could move because of the technology of air conditioning. But what really grew the Sun Belt, as we know it today, in really the late 80s, the 90s, and the aughts, is cheap housing, cheap energy, coal energy, non-union labor, a tax revolt, tax caps, which, by the way, they're paying for all of this now. Those externalities are really roosting. And that drew in employers, low cost of living. But where we stand today is the cost of living in the Sun Belt is going up and up and up. The affordability dimensions of the Sun Belt are going down. And those originating logics that drew people in are fracturing. And so what we see, and I wasn't a co-author with my colleagues there, at former colleagues at the San Francisco Fed, but the arguments that they make, and the observations that they have actually, are that certain cohorts of the population are indeed moving from areas of basically hot areas to cold areas. And we see this with younger people in their 20s, which makes sense. There's a greater awareness and perception about climate change. Maybe you could even argue their perception of risk may be greater than perhaps even really is, but nonetheless. And people, and this is very, very important, particularly in the context of an aging society, people in their 60s and 70s and up. These are two cohorts in our population that are very sensitive. Well, they're on a fixed income, more or less, or they're leading to a fixed income, and they're very sensitive to shifts in inflation, insurance, and instability. Right? They're trying to build stable homes, and here they are putting themselves in a position in a high-risk area where there's a lot of instability. I think that's the best way to look at it. And the data really supports this, that the Sun Belt is beginning to reverse among these particular cohorts. So this gets to your second question, which are, who are these people on the move, right? And so what I identify in the book is there's a bunch of different cohorts here. We tend to conceptualize climate and migration, or human mobility and climate, or climate migration, if you will, as people who are displaced, people who are just pushed out of their homes, right? But there's a bunch of other cohorts here. On the other end of the equation, we have cohorts who are preemptive value investors. They're out there looking and anticipating where people are going to be moving. They're making bets on this. I go into the kind of portfolio strategies of this in the book and the underlying sort of strategic investment base. But those people exist. Some of them are professional investors. Some of them are just casual, wealthy people. We also have back on the, let's say, the low to moderate income end of the equation, we have people who are more or less sorting. And they're making decisions essentially between the cost of living and the risk of loss. And they're sorting into essentially high-risk areas, or sometimes sorting out of high-risk areas, because they're making trade-offs between relatively affordable cost of living in a high-risk zone in exchange for the risk of loss or the potential risk of loss in the future, right? So they're sorting into these high-risk zones, but sometimes they sort out. Then we have people that are somewhere in the middle. They're circumstantial opportunists. they're not making decisions about where and how to live in the context of climate change. But when presented with information, for instance, through disclosures or through Zillow or something like this, and they see a value opportunity, they will then jump on that in the moment, right? So it's not shit. It's only in circumstantially shaping their decisions. And then finally, we have people who are just electively mobile. And this is an argument I've been making for a long time. Because again, we tend to create the heuristic that climate mobility is about people who just lose their homes and floods and fires and things like that. But it's the electively mobile. It's people who have the labor mobility, who have the skills, the wealth, and the capacity, and the capability, as they would call it in the literature, to move and be on the move. And there's a lot of those people, particularly in the context of an aging society, where people are particularly concerned about where they're going to build generational wealth for themselves and their families going forward, among many other motivations for trying to understand where this physical landscape of risk and opportunity rests.
All right, one more question about the markets here before we get into the built environment dimensions, which I'll let Dan take from there. But you are also famous for coining or at least popularizing climate gentrification. And so also the shift of these cohorts inside of metro areas. I think the example you have in the book, or I think is the most famous, is sort of now the effort to gentrify Little Haiti inside of Miami, which is traditionally one of the poorer and black neighborhoods, but because it sits on higher ground, it's moving there. And your paper that you wrote that's often cited there about being able to see changes in pricing in almost real time there on almost like meter level here about high ground suggests that that this will be priced into markets. And so I'm curious your thoughts on this, particularly in the year since you wrote that paper, because I remember it was influential to me when Sean Becketti was the chief economist at Freddie Mac in 2016 and wrote this influential blog post asking, will the markets absorb this in an orderly fashion and price in the risk, or will there be opportunistic selling followed by panic selling and we get a crash, like a Minsky moment in climate? And I'm curious where you fall in this debate right now, because it seems like you're on the rational side of this. Americans will make decisions within constraints, and this will be sorted out and processed. I generally think Americans will panic, but...
Yeah, Greg, it's a great question. One, what happened in Little Haiti has to be understood in broader terms to be a component of conventional forms of gentrification, and climate gentrification probably played a role there. But I would argue, for the most part, it was the making of more conventional forms of gentrification long in the running. I think a lot of what has happened in Miami has been misunderstood in the interest of a particular social justice political movement. And that's just how the politics of climate change works. But I'd happy to talk about that. To your question, I've got bad news for you. It's actually both. And this is what the economics literature tells us, is that, sure, there is this kind of rational risk capitalization in the value of property. That is, buyers and sellers are discounting risk when they exchange properties or buy and sell properties. In some areas, across the board, that's happening. In some areas, though, it's highly dependent or correlative to people's belief systems or the contextual belief systems around you. So we have areas where people just don't believe in climate change, or there's self-identifiably correlates with Republican, conservative, climate's a hoax kind of thing. In those areas, you don't see that discounting happening, right? And so what you then see is an event happens, and then all of a sudden there's a severe overcorrection. In fact, one could argue we're seeing this in Southwest Florida right now, where climate was really never on the radar. You have a series of events back to back. It actually starts changing people's perceptions and belief systems, and then the market moves very quickly. So I think in some places that rationalized kind of market capitalization and price response is there. Is it an adequate price response? That's a whole other question to have. But in other cases, I think we're setting ourselves up for a true Minsky moment, where you're going to see significant adjustments in valuation, and there are going to be a lot of losses along the way.
It was just for listeners, a Minsky moment refers to Hyman Minsky, which is basically when the market basically simultaneously reprices all risk and you see a significant drop in valuations. The global financial crisis was a version of that with collateralized debt obligations, and Jesse and I and others have been arguing that we'll probably see one with climate. But Dan, over to you for the actual build form of this, because there's a lot of that in the book too.
Indeed. So there are three key words that you identify that I put on my Post-it note on the cover of the galley: mitigation, adaptation, and resilience. I'd like you to go through each of those and how you define those, and how they apply to the constructive environment, perhaps in a sort of descending order of scale. So, going from the industrial scale Army Corps of Engineers type response on each of those levels down to the, neighborhood level or the individual building level. I don't know if that makes sense, but I'm sort of picturing a 6-point star here that coalesces in the middle.
Yeah, so thank you for bringing that up because there is a chapter that I thought was very important to write in this book, which is it brings some order, it attempts to bring some order to the epistemology of what we call adaptation science more broadly. So when people talk about resilience or adaptation or mitigation in different ways, particularly resilience, it's quite convoluted, rhetorical, and imprecise. And that has clouded our ability to understand the advantages, disadvantages, and trade offs associated with different design, planning, and policy interventions associated with each one of these concepts, right? So, what I attempt to do in the book is to introduce readers to what these concepts mean, how they're applied, and how they're applied at different scales. Mitigation, for instance, you're talking about, or what you're referencing specifically, is hazard mitigation or risk mitigation, is, I think, well understood in terms of the capacity to prevent external perturbations or external events. You're preventing an external phenomenon from impacting or even getting close to the internal identity or operations of a design material system. So you're keeping external to the processes. Adaptation has lots of different manifestations, incremental, transformational. I go through that. We could spend a lot of time talking about these things. I think perhaps be of less use to your listeners, but what I'll focus in on for a second, which I think probably will resonate with people, is the idea of resilience. Well, as it turns out, resilience, there's lots of different types of resilience. There's no singular form of resilience, right? Principally, what we see in practice, particularly in the United States, but really globally, are three forms of resilience. We see engineering resilience, ecological resilience, and community resilience. And they all mean and are operationalized and are applied in very, very different ways. And in fact, engineering resilience, which speaks to the designed capacity of an engineered system to revert to a single equilibrium point in time and space, more or less, it's a reversionary elastic function of a design system, is quite distinct from, let's say, community resilience, which actually has transformative implications associated with social learning and actually has multiple potential states of equilibrium or stability associated with it. So you can think about, community resilience, we're learning, and there's a lot of potential stable states that come in that post-event transformation. It's not quite transformation, but it's a post-event reorganization of social capital and knowledge. So it's contested in many ways. It's normative, right? It's totally normative when we think about it. Engineering resilience is descriptive. We can describe it, we can measure it in time, space, money, etc., etc. We can engineer and design around it. These are very different ideas and very different concepts that often get conflated along the way. And so what I try to do in the book is to bring some organization to that and to lay it out so that going forward we can have a more precise conversation about what we really mean. Because a lot of times in practice, some people are talking about even ecological resilience, which speaks to nature-based systems and different modes of not homeostasis or stability seeking, but actually the supporting of dynamic ecological system boundaries. And that's quite different from the single equilibrium phenomenon associated with elastic functions in engineering design. In fact, there's often conflicts there between stationarity and dynamic processes and systems. So that conflict alone creates a lot of problems in practice. And it's because of imprecise knowledge, language, and application of that. And I think it just takes time and maybe even books like this to help simplify it and organize the knowledge around it.
I mean, what I experience all the time, proposals from architects and urban planners operating at various scales, and they all kind of require a sort of tacit understanding of those three concepts in order to work. I guess that in a situation where, let's assume that for the next at least 3.5 years that the federal government is abdicating its role in any of those categories: adaptation, mitigation, resilience. Um, what if you were at the head of a, say, a major architecture firm right now? What would you be focusing on if as part of if you wanted to sort of design your business strategy around the trends that you've identified in your book? Like, it, knowing what the political situation is, and that we're probably going to get no help from the feds. In fact, the feds seem to be actively accelerating climate change.
Yeah, so if you're sitting in an architecture firm and the strategy is, well, how do we take this knowledge, apply it, and internalize it into what we're doing, the products and services that we're selling, and the like? Listen, the federal government plays almost zero role in any of this, right? White House administration after White House administration put all their eggs in the basket, mostly as it relates to building codes on this front. And guess what? That went nowhere for a lot of different reasons. Your listeners know all about the politics of building codes. If I'm sitting as a CEO of an architecture firm, this is a little bit different for an engineering firm, and we can talk about why that is. But in an architecture firm, these things matter because they relate to your standard and duty of care and your capacity to manage your professional liabilities. Right? This isn't a value add serve or additional service or whatever it may be, however you want to think about it. This is actually core to your underlying practice. And I think in particularly high risk, high impact jurisdictions, that standard and duty of care has already shifted in favor of an obligation to internalize these modes of analysis and very often technical applications and design techniques or materials, et cetera, into your projects. So it's already here, right? There's already a kind of legal risk management dimension that's pushing in that direction. And I think that happens independent of whatever the federal government dictates. These practices have evolved and have been internalized in the United States and globally without any kind of regulatory push. In fact, regulation could even work in the opposite direction of the intended result by over-specifying and crowding out other forms of innovation, particularly material innovation. So, it's full steam ahead in that regard. I think there's some challenges with the industry itself more broadly. The work that was done by, let's say, Rachel Minnery at AIA for many years and her group in driving the architecture community to standardize these things in terms of the practice of it all, had huge impact and huge influence. Do you see that kind of building coalition that she had put together move forward with these ideas? Not really, and not in the same extent. There's other priorities. That's always the case. But at the end of the day, it's about standard duty of care. It's a local phenomenon. If you're working in a high risk, high impact geography and site, and you're not considering this range or suite of available tools and modes of analysis to at least inform your client about what their options are, then you're doing it wrong.
Yeah, I think it does seem that, I mean, in some ways, it's almost, people probably see that the title and description of this book and they think that it's doom casting, but it's really not. I mean, what you're basically saying is that people respond to reality and they respond to market signals, even if our political infrastructure is not set up to do that. And, we should have some faith that those who can make these choices and have the means to make these choices about where they locate and where they build anew will, at least give us signals about where we should go next. And we definitely should not be looking to our broader authorities for those signals.
And this is where I want to jump in here because, all right, so if there's one thing that Jesse is probably most known for, infamously, is for appearing on the cover of the New York Times with climate-proof Duluth on frozen Lake Superior, and yeah, and this discourse around climate havens, which I say earlier this year, Jesse and I were both taken to task in the same Guardian article for this, which I found. And Jesse, you obviously get into this in the book. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. But it is interesting how that discourse to me strikes me has gotten really toxic really fast because particularly after Asheville, which was marketed as a climate haven, people really seem to have been blackpilled by this and basically be like,
Yeah, yeah,
well, why be safer at all? I mean, why take any precaution? And so I'm
yeah.
curious, like
What
culturally, yeah.
Thank you for bringing that up. So I have a section in the book called Climate Havens, the promise and peril of climate havens, right? And basically, climate havens was a creation of the media. It was basically more or less the creation of clickbait. So you know how media works. They love to create lists of things and things like that. There's no serious scholar that was standing out there saying this is a climate haven. My work in Duluth was not saying that Duluth was a climate haven. My work in Duluth was saying, hey, eventually some people are going to move here. This is a very small city in a very small location, 100,000 people. If you have 1,000 people move in, it's going to change your city. The question is, how are you going to manage that growth in the interest of sustainable urban development and decarbonization and de-risking your built environment? It was a thought experiment. It wasn't going out there and saying Duluth is the next climate haven. People completely bastardized that. So, yeah, climate havens don't exist. I think we all intuitively know that. You can't run or escape from climate change. But at the same time, there are sending zones and receiving zones. And some of those receiving zones are right in our backyard. But some of those receiving zones are clear across the country. And guess what? After our work in Duluth, thousands of people moved to Duluth, right? And they now have a lot of the crowding out problems that I predicted, that told people that they should get on to begin to understand this. So there's consequences to these things. Now, as it relates to Asheville, North Carolina, Asheville never marketed itself. And to Duluth's credit, they never marketed themselves either. There was no marketing. Like, there are some cities out there that do market this stuff, right? A little bit Cincinnati, you could argue, Buffalo,
Yeah, I would
Milwaukee,
say Mayor of
etc.
Buffalo famously called itself that, yeah, without doing
Right,
anything
right.
about it.
Asheville never marketed itself. Asheville was legitimately a receiving zone. And I interviewed, and there's people in the book that I talked to that moved to Asheville. They were moving there precisely because of their understanding of more ambient temperatures and more moderate temperatures. But again, you can't outrun climate change. Is it a climate haven? No, it's impossible. Also, you have to understand the extent of the damage in Asheville. People often don't know Asheville. And yeah, there were areas that flooded, and it was terrible. It was devastating. It was a human tragedy. Those areas that flooded in the past, people basically knew some of those areas. They didn't know the extent to really actually which landslides killed a lot of people. And a lot of that was more in the exurban area, not in Asheville itself. But most of Asheville and the kind of components of Asheville, I mean, they were hit hard, but I don't think it was totalizing devastation as people contextualize it. But here's the thing. And here's the thing about Asheville. Asheville will continue to be a receiving zone in the future. In fact, if we know anything about American post-disaster urbanization, is that people are just going to use this to clean the slate. They're going to move people out. They're going to build to a higher performance standard in terms of the underlying design engineering of where the people are living in high amenity, high risk areas. And it will only accelerate the population increases in the growth pressure that Asheville has. So if you think that that flood was the end to Asheville being a receiving zone, it's the beginning.
All right. Well, separate from Asheville, and I totally agree with you there. The two, you also make the case in the book, which I have done and others have done too, about the Midwest. And it seems like I forget which episode we had, but I think we had Alan Malik on to talk about legacy cities, his work looking at Midwest legacy cities. This is I don't know a year or two ago. But I'm curious your thoughts, Jesse, on like a realistic program for the former Rust Belt. There's a lot. It's easy to fantasize, given the fact that these cities were built for populations twice their size, that they're in more temperate areas or in freshwater lakes. But is there like a realistic program, and where would you start in terms of like actually directing national policy or even state policy, even the state legislature level, to start drawing these people in? Because we have seen like Indiana and Ohio, their economic development arms have realized like we can attract hybrid and remote workers, and they're starting to think about these kinds of things too. So where do you see green shoots in terms of preparing better receiving zones at a scale larger than a Duluth or an Asheville?
It's such a tricky and I think tough question. I really don't think the federal government plays a major role here. There can be some minor things in terms of policy that they can do. I mean, certainly tracking people and data within the Census Bureau is a good place to
Well,
start in
I
that
imagine
regard.
like DOT could do stuff with block grants and all sorts of things in terms
No,
of
I mean,
directing
there's
federal
things that they
funding.
can do that can be catalytic, but I mean, really, people overestimate the role of the federal government here in climate and in climate adaptation, even in climate mitigation. I mean, tax policy, industrial policy, it works, it galvanizes things. But on the adaptation front, outside of state hazard mitigation planning, it's really state and local government ultimately that are responsible. But I want to address your question. So I think, the argument I've made for a number of years is that this is really probably at best about regional planning and local planning, like urban planning 101 and growth management 101, right? And the audience, a lot of times people say, oh, these cities are marketing for climate change. They're marketing themselves as climate havens and stuff. They're really not. What they're trying to do is build an internal audience and an internal coalition to make quality of life investments that are in the interest in sustainability investments that are in the interest of the people who live there now. And they're using climate mobility and climate migration, things like that, as a kind of rhetorical arm to say, hey, let's get prepared by investing today for today's residents, right? And I think there's a pushback against that, but I don't think people recognize that they're really trying to reach an internal audience with that stuff. They're not legitimately going out there and trying to work with companies in terms of corporate relocations and things like that. I mean, that's happening a little bit in Milwaukee, but for the most part, they're trying to build momentum internally for core sustainability planning, walkability, transit-oriented development, things that we already know. That's what they're really trying to do. And I think in many ways, that's where you begin with this stuff. And I think it's those quality of life investments, things we already know how to and what to do, that increase the attractiveness of these places. Because in my mind, this is about housing. It's about the accessibility and affordability of housing. And the Midwest will ultimately grow for the exact same reasons that the Sun Belt grew, right? Except it will have the added benefit of perhaps, in some places, more moderate weather, access to fresh water, environmental resource stuff. But they're still going to have a huge obligation to manage those resources, The Great Lakes, you can't take that for granted, how much work and time and effort it takes. And by the way, the federal government does play a role in this, in managing the water quality of the Great Lakes and the water resources management, particularly in dialogue or in partnership with Canada in that regard. That takes a lot of time, work, effort, So you can't take these things for granted. But I think, to your question, I think this is really about local governments, local politics, using the tools of sustainability planning, growth management, and investing in their communities in ways that are about quality of life and attracting people. And that will ultimately, I think, together with the very low basis in their housing cost and stock, ultimately drive people in.
All right. Well, I do want to flip this around then in terms of about receiving, about how this changes you asserted at the outset in terms of politics, because if the U.S. federal government doesn't play much of a role in doing regional planning on the Great Lakes, the President of the United States has repeatedly talked about annexing Canada as a state. And we also, I'm sure, of course, that migration, immigration, and climate plays a role, of course, in the hardening of the U.S. border and American immigration policy. And then also the most shocking thing to me when I was reading about this in literature, not your book, but before, I think it was the book Storming the Wall, about during the Dust Bowl, where California and Colorado both set up internal checkpoints to turn away the Okies. I'm curious what your thoughts are, and we'll get to your final chapter, but like, how is this going to play out politically here, given that we have so much of a sentiment of like XYZ is full, Duluth, other places as well, we don't want migrants.
Yeah, it's hard to know the various scenarios and pathways from which you can go down. But one thing I think that lands us in a little bit in a sort of different perspective is that there's been a vast network in the Midwest to house and resettle people, refugees, right? And some of these are formal U.S. State Department refugee resettlement programs, but they've also developed a pretty vast network of series of programs for immigrant resettlement rather than refugee resettlement. Those programs are now being, in some cases, being retuned for internal migration, internal domestic migration. And, the question is, from a sociocultural point of view, like, how welcoming are people, right? I mean, maybe we don't need to have checkpoints like in California, but like, what are the attributes of a culture and society to be welcoming to those from the outside, not just refugees and immigrants, but also people moving from lower Alabama and the Gulf Coast of Florida, et cetera, et cetera. What does that look like? And how do we measure that and think about that? And that's definitely on the horizons of researchers and scholars and people thinking about this very practically. But I think from the kind of civic infrastructure that we see, the Midwest does have a real leg up because they've been thinking about this for their own sort of population survival for a couple generations now. And I think that there is a welcomeness. Now, in certain rural areas, maybe not so much, right? And that will be challenged, and that will no doubt create conflict. I mean, the conflict in the reordering of our population in spatial terms will be inevitable. It'll be political. There's violence on the horizon we can't escape from. The question is, what do we do about it? How do we manage it? How do we change the expectations and recognize that in a context, particularly even aging society, people are just so critically important to the vitality of our communities. You can exclude all you want. You can build exclusionary walls and political, economic, and land use and zoning and everything else you can to keep people out. But at the end of the day, it's people that are reviving, and particularly we've seen this in upstate New York and western Pennsylvania and Ohio, northeast Ohio. These immigrant communities, particularly in recent years, have revived entire towns that were really on the edge. So I tend to believe and have a lot of faith in that capacity of people who are on the move. They're on the move and they're on a mission, right? They are, I think when you're moving and you're being dislocated and you're relocating, you're trying to build something. You're not just accepting the status quo. You know that there's a moment in time when you have the opportunity to build and create. And that's quite different from the kind of complacency that we often get sometimes in populations, or the immobility that people have. I mean, think how much immobility we have in the United States. Dual income households, student debt of all kinds, et cetera, et cetera. There's a lot of reasons we're just not moving like we used to. So those who are on the move are strivers. I tend to believe that. That I may be naive, and that may be a fiction in its own right, but I think there's something to that.
All right, well, speaking of violence on the horizon, let's get to your last chapter. Before we get into some of the specific predictions you make in that, in America's 2079, I first want to ask, you've written a book that is full of, built environment and architectural analysis and policy recommendations, but you choose to end with a fictional chapter. And you and I both talked about the practice of cli-fi, climate fiction. I'm curious why you chose to do this, to end with, straight up speculation, and who you hope to reach with it, like what your aim is in terms of switching up your approach at the 11th hour.
Yeah, so let me just make a quick qualification. I'm indeed not an architect. I've taught in architecture schools and in architecture departments for a very long time. Technically an urban planner. I studied the engineering and economics of the built environment and civil infrastructure and things like that. I love teaching studios and teaching architecture, but technically I'm not an architect, so I should be careful there. And unfortunately I'm also a lawyer, so that also ruined some part of my brain. But yeah, cli-fi. Greg, I actually have to give you a lot of credit because your work and others, but particularly what you were doing as I would label a futurist, whether you accept that or not, was very inspirational to me. You may remember I sent you kind of a draft of the climate credit score years ago.
Yes, which we'll get into here. One of your best innovations, yeah.
Why do this? For me, I always wanted to read a fiction chapter, or a science fiction chapter or fiction chapter that had footnotes from actual science and social science. And I always wondered, why didn't people do that? Because when you read a climate fiction book, it's hard to distinguish, I think, for the kind of lay person, what they're drawing upon that's actually real versus what's not real. You know what I mean? The boundaries, and that's kind of maybe what makes it interesting, is the boundaries between nonfiction and fiction are often blurred in cli-fi. But why not be more explicit about it? So my goal was hey, I'm going to set up this entire book of nonfiction and science and social science. I'm going to lay out what I see as the facts and the areas of debate. And actually try not to be terribly policy prescriptive, but I'm going to lay it out, and then I'm going to explore that through what I pitch the publisher as in a scenario. But But right, it's just one of many potential scenarios. But I think it gives life, at least through dialogue and the kind of fictional history, it gives life to what I see are the substantive elements of fragility in our society and the aspects that we're not fully, I think, appreciating systematically represent risk and conflict associated with climate change. Because again, our orientation is like shock, right? Our orientation is the shock of a hurricane, the shock of a flood. Our orientation is not the stress that it places on our institutions and on our society and on our interpersonal relationships. And so for me, writing this fictional chapter was like, I want to look at the stress and how that stress, and together with the shocks, reshapes everything from our interpersonal relationships to our fundamental institutions that we rely on to define our country. So for me, there's a kind of latent nationalism here, civic nationalism, not ethno-nationalism, but it's a kind of appeal to a civic nationalism about the collective future that we all have. And that's why I wanted to do it.
Well, it's funny you mentioned civic nationalism, given that your chapter as a formative event features the very brief Floridian Civil War. In the few minutes we have left here, could you take us on a quick tour of your scenario?
Yeah, so there's something called the Florida. I wouldn't call it quite a civil war. I think civil wars are much more widespread in terms of the landscape of conflict. But it's a partition, right? And what happens is in the book, there's a hurricane. It's a Category 6 hurricane. Hits Hurricane Pass in Pinellas County near Sarasota. It's an absolutely devastating hurricane, kills thousands of people. But what had happened in the preceding years was that the state of Florida, as the market economy was adapting and sort of pulling capital out of Florida, the state of Florida itself became a major market actor and provided mortgage finance and insurance. It's not just subsidizing the market, it increasingly becomes the market. The hurricane is so devastating across the region. And by the way, South Florida had been pulling up into Central Florida over the decades, so it was highly concentrated as population and economy in Central Florida, that this hurricane event basically leads to the fiscal unwinding. A state can't file bankruptcy, for instance. These entities could not legally file bankruptcy. And they have to basically kind of liquidate the state, liquidate assets. It creates a great deal of financial and fiscal pressure on the state, and as well as political pressure. Republicans get voted out. Democrats come in, make the problem worse. It really, what we see is a division, a cultural division between the central South Florida and the coalitions of the urbanites of South Florida with the urbanites of Central Florida, because now Central Florida is a major population hub, with the more rural working class dimensions of North Florida and their sort of Christian nationalist identities. They call Orlando really falls off the mark here because Disney World and others have to move out because dengue and everything, and the whole tourism economy of Florida completely collapses. Orlando turns into this kind of Atlantic City, which at this time was long gone. They called it Sodom and Gorlando, you know. So you get this kind of fiction and rhetoric in the north of Florida of this of vice, right? And that of exploitation, and of all of these migrants have moved from the Caribbean into South Florida. It's costing them a lot of money. You know, it's the same rhetoric we see today, right? And so ultimately, there's the state of Florida is so basically, you know, can't file bankrupt. They're not quite bankrupt. They need to do the one thing that people fear most, which is pass an income tax. And so they go to a constitutional convention in Orlando, and basically, you know, you can read about in the book. There is a conflict that breaks out, and that armed conflict ultimately gets put down by the 1st Marine Division. National Guard wasn't any good because all they had been doing has been working on hurricanes. They didn't really even have weapons. They hadn't really thought about urban combat. And in the end, Congress approves this, and it kind of moves very quickly. And the state partitions into 2 states, the state of North Florida and the state of South Florida. There's a kind of underlying violence there. I don't really get into it. The violence is a kind of institutional violence, I suppose. But it explains the background, a little bit of the background of what pushed some of the characters in this chapter north and pushed them to upstate. We don't really know where upstate is, but it helps create the landscape of dislocation. Because a lot of times, this, by the way, is a familiar story to a lot of people all around the world, but maybe not in the United States. And it starts to help you understand like what are the different factors that shape dislocation in a much more broader way. So my ambition was to say it wasn't about the violence. That wasn't the intent. The intent was that actually growing up, in Florida and Georgia in the South my entire life, like for me, I always thought that Florida was already two different states culturally. So the question was like, how do you get there? And so the real intent of this partition component of the chapter is to actually walk through the fragility of the underlying economic structures and the extent to which there's a limit on state capitalism, right? And the limit to which the state of Florida itself can drive the flow of capital and how dangerous that can be for the collective. So that's it.
So I guess I have to take back a little bit of my comment that this is a surprisingly optimistic book. It actually is a very well balanced book between dystopia and optimism, and it places a lot of faith in, I think, that there are still rational actors in the populace, and they are capable of making decisions based on facts. And ultimately, there's going to be some unfortunate further disasters and incidents, and there's a kind of, I think you describe it as a slow violence taking place, as opposed to,
Yeah, let me just say
yeah,
something real quick, which is that, yeah, I mean, that rationality that you speak of, that rests in this idea of like price signal theory, that markets will send a signal and then people respond. For some people that may be true, for others that may not be so true. And in certain places of the book, I actually draw upon anthropology and archaeology, but particularly anthropology, and say like, okay, adaptation, people have always adapted, right? And if there's a balance between positive and negative or perspectives or utopian, there's no utopia dystopia component to this, I don't think. But if it's optimistic or pessimistic in the way I'm balancing it, it's because that's the course of human history. That's that's the nature of the history of civilization. There's good and bad, and that's what I really wanted to do with this book, was just lay out the good and the bad. There's no final story here. The story never ends. It's just iterations on cultural practices and economics. Yeah, some people will adhere to price signal theory. Some people are totally rational, and guess what? A ton of other people are totally irrational. So, where do we end up? I don't know, but these are the mechanisms of change. And this is the language of how we talk about it.
All right. Well, one last question, Jesse, because you alluded to earlier, we glossed over it. You mentioned the climate intelligence arms race, and even before the current administration, whatever happens to NOAA, there has been the rise of these basically black box modelers in terms of what will happen with climate. You've advised one. I helped my buddy Parag Khanna launch AlphaGeo for one, because I particularly wanted to be in the room with some of the big institutional investors who in theory could direct capital away from high risk regions, from sending to receiving zones. And to me that was eye-opening, because as Spencer Glendon, another figure in this world who like you can move in financial circles, he'd been at Wellington, I think, had warned me that like basically the money is slow and dumb and that they are not going to save us. And so as a way, I'm sort of teeing this all up as a question, is like, who do you hope reads this book? And can you convince the investors, the institutional investors, the markets to move on this? Like, what do you think will be the lever, the wedge that might actually drive this change?
Yeah, and I've advised a number of firms in this space, and I actually took before releasing this book, took the step of liquidating all of my positions and all of my ostensible conflicts of interest in this regard. And I'm actually no longer serving in any capacity as advisor and investor in this broader space. It's nothing against the companies that I work with. It's just a different point in my life, I would say. But I totally agree with Spencer. I mean, yeah. Do I believe that some people on Wall Street are going to read this book and then change their perspectives? No, not at all, not in the least bit. What I want are everyday Americans, just the average person who's browsing has some peripheral interest in climate to understand that climate, or just anybody, to understand that climate's shaping your life in like the most profound ways that you probably don't appreciate. And that's been the kind of arc of my career, is like I've been trying to tell a story about climate, about how it impacts your bank account, your retirement account, your house. That climate resonates like on your balance sheet as a household, as a company. That's where climate sinks in. And I think that's where people, once they become more aware, or some people, of course, that doesn't really matter because they have nothing. They have very little. But I think it helps us, understand the totality of climate's impacts, help us all make better decisions. So I don't think climate is going to steer capital or motivate capital in ways that it isn't already investing or moving. That's in fact, I feel reasonably optimistic about that in the long run, of course. But I just want people to see the totality of the stress, not the shock, to the move beyond the hurricanes and the floods. What comes next, right? And how does that impact me? I live in the middle of nowhere or whatever. I don't know. I live in New York City. I live in Philadelphia. I live in, rural Alabama. Like, climate seems far from me somehow. It seems off in the distance. And I guess what I'm trying to reach people with this book is that it's in your backyard. It's already here. It's already shaping, your wealth and your trajectory, your health. There's a lot of I talk a lot about health and medicine in this book. It's already shaping where your life is going to go. So let's try to understand that. That's what I'm trying to get across with people.
Jesse, I want to thank you very much for your insights and joining Unfrozen today. The guest today is Jesse Keenan, author of North, The Future of Post-Climate America, coming out very shortly at the end of 2025. A very timely book, and thank you for spending the time with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.